Okay, so a few ideas on Parshas Shelach. So there's an interesting change right at the beginning of the parsha. There's a shift in tense from the plural to the singular, which is quite interesting. When it describes the journey, they went on, it says, this is Paragud Gimel Pasuk Chof Beis. It says, Vayalu Vanegev. They went up through the south. Vayovoy ad Chevron. And he came to Chevron. And then it says, Vayalu Vanegev. Vayovoy ad Chevron. He came to Chevron. Right? So why is there the shift from they? We're talking about the Meraglim as a whole. They came. And it shifts to, and he came. They went up, and then he came to Chevron. Now Rashi famously says that it was because it was Kolev alone who went to Chevron, right? Because Cholev was the one who wanted to go to Ma'aras Machpelah. He wanted to go and prostrate himself, says Rashi, by the Kivrei Ovos, where Avram Yitzchak and Yaakov were buried, so that he shouldn't be swept up in the Merag, right? In the Merag. Now, but at the end of the day, it is still the simple pshat in the posuk is difficult to understand why you have that shift in tense. There's a sefer called the Kometz HaMincha, and he says. I think it's someone called Rav Tzintz, and he says like this, that the simple explanation is that each individual came themselves. Yeah, each individual person came by themselves. And what does that mean? So he says how the change from the rabbim to the singular from the plural to the singular is because this was how they entered and they started on the negative pathway. This was how they went from being how the whole thing went wrong. The start was here. Why? Because at the start it was vaya'alu. They went up to the south, right? So in other words, they were there together. They and they were representing their shvatim. They went as, right? Each one was a prince of the Sheva. They're all leaders, Roshi base of Kulam Anoshim, Roshi B'nei Yisrael, Hema. So they went in the sense of a plural. We have a responsibility. We have a duty. It's not about us. We're not individuals. We're a plural. Bayalu, right? They came up together. But then when they got to Chevron, they lost that in some way. And therefore now it says each individual came. Each one came by themselves. And that's why it changes by Yovoy ad Chevron. He came. Singular to Chevron, right? And he says that's why it says Alu Zeh Banegev. Perhaps there's a hint to this that Alu Zeh Banegev. Moshe Rabbeinu tells them Alu Zeh. Zeh is Gematria 12. The 12 Shvatim, right? And that's what was going on. They were supposed to remember that what their duty was, their responsibility was, but instead they lost that, and that shift in focus from their public sense of duty and responsibility and why they were and who they were into as individuals was the beginning of the downfall in a certain respect. It's an interesting take on that shift in tense that once you become, and it has a very obvious and in a way straightforward message, that if we realize, even if we face a challenge, right, and we realize and we're not sure how to react and how to deal with it, a hugely important factor is a sense of responsibility and beyond ourselves. We're not just about us, it's about something greater than us. Once we feel that it's just about us, we're just as individuals, who am I? I'm nothing, and therefore you can be misled to incorrect and negative conclusions, as indeed happened to them. So if you go now to Perek Yud Gimel Posuk Lamed Gimel, very famously we have Lamed Beis first. Eretz Acheles Yoshveha. Now this idea of the fact that what did they do? They came along and they said this lashon hara about them. Dibasa Aretz Toras Chaim Yisrael, right? Posuk Lamed Beis. Ashavana L'Toras Eretz Acheles Yoshveha. There's a land that consumes its inhabitants, and everyone is huge. Anshe Midos, right? That's what they famously said. Now the difficulty is, Rashi says that the Medrash says, wherever we went, they were burying the dead. Hashem did it for a good reason. So they would be busy with their mourning, their avela. So they knew they just wouldn't think about them. It was a favor for them. It was a tova for them. And that's how they were and yet they turned it into a negative, and they said, look, it's a land that consumes its inhabitants, right? And the Kliyokar here, if you've got Mikra, you'll see it. If you ask an obvious question, he says, "V'kosher v'chiba avuz zenik remotzi diba." Is that why they're called speaking lashon hara? V'halo higidu hu emes mashiro. They just told the truth. They told the truth. They saw. That's what they observed. They observed everyone burying the dead, and therefore they made a logical conclusion. Eretz Cheles Yoshvel. It's a land. There's something wrong with this land. There's something wrong with it, right? It's consuming its inhabitants. There's something negative going on here, right? And are they punished so severely, or at least are they called Motziei Dibba, speaking lashon hara about Eretz Yisrael, right? Because they didn't realize that Hashem did this as a favor for them, right? And they're even called foolish as a result, right? So okay, fine. So they were foolish. They didn't realize that actually it was all a divine plan. But at the end of the day, to say they are called speaking lashon hara because they observed people burying the dead and therefore made the more logical conclusion, which is there's something wrong with this place, right? Why was it that they were punished so severely? And the Kliyokar says something which on the surface seems to be very straightforward, but actually it's got a very, very important, I think, message. The Kliyokar says, "V'nira," it would seem what they should have at least done is they should have thought about what they knew about the inhabitants of Canaan. They've been told, not the first time, the whole way through the Torah, since they left Mitzrayim, right? They've been told this is what you need to expect. Go back to Vayikra, right? Vayikra, the Arroyos, right? Kamase Eretz or whatever, and then talks about Kamah, right? They told the whole time about what they're like and the level, the depraved lifestyle, the pagan depraved lifestyle that they live. So they should have obviously realized that what was going on here was because of what they did wrong. The kavuros should be the burial of that must have been was a result of their sin. These people who are living in Canaan, he says, they knew they were worse than the other nations. And they drew the opposite conclusion. They said that the people we saw inside, Anshe Midos Tovos, they're tzaddikim, Anshe Midos. The people of Midos, they're tzaddikim, they're righteous. And they went into they made a whole Torah instead, that it must be because there's some negative climate. It's a malaria-infested swamp. That's the type of conclusion they came to. And it consumes its inhabitants. And how much more so, us, we're not used to it, we're going to be damaged as a result. And therefore, the point is, and that's the name, and he goes on to describe in more detail. We can go through the whole thing, but he goes into how much more detail, how effectively they were drawing all these grand conclusions from what they observed based on Teva, based on the natural way, in the natural order. And if you look at it on the surface, that's what it seems to be like, right? And he said that's why they say the Zeh period, this is its fruit, because he says that that's what they were demonstrating with the fruit. They were saying, you see, it's a weird place, because there's a lot of heat, it produces these great fruits, but the people themselves are they suffer and they die. Okay, so what is the Kliyokar saying? The simple explanation he's saying is like this. He's saying that the reason why they're punished for saying that it's an Eretz Cheles Yoshvel, when all it was is just an observation. They observed that it was a place that consumed its inhabitants. But the really Anashim did it as a favor for them. Kliyokar is saying like this, that the punishment that comes to them and the mistake they make is by not understanding the context in of their journey, the context of their mission. The context of their mission is not to arrive on the scene and be, okay, well, let's observe it as if we have no context at all. It seems to be this is a place where it's a very bad climate and there's something wrong with it. People are dying everywhere. What do you mean? You've heard and should have taken on board everything you've heard until this point, that these people are not good people. And therefore that should have been your conclusion. Not that there's something wrong with the land, there's something wrong with the people. And that would have changed your whole perspective. And this point is a consistent theme in the consistent theme throughout what the Meraglim do wrong. We'll come back to it, right? It's a consistent theme of how they go down the route of what we would call teva. They look at the natural order and they make what is a logical conclusion, and ostensibly there's nothing wrong with that. but in the context of how they are meant to be living, and the context of the journey out of Mitzrayim and the journey to Eretz Yisrael, it's completely wrong. It's radically wrong. Okay, and we'll come back to another idea about that shortly. But before we do, just to go sort of in order, the pasuk about the Chagovim. So this famous idea, which we've spoken about in the past, the idea of that they said we were in our eyes like grasshoppers, and so too we were in their eyes, because that's how they perceive themselves, and therefore that's how they saw others perceive them as well. He said there's nemolim, there's ants in the vineyard. Rashi says that's what they heard them say. Nemolim yesh bekerem. The Sforno says, if you look at the Sforno says, and this is what we were in their eyes, kachagovim, like locusts, opochos mizeh, or even less than locusts. And that's why they didn't bother attacking us. They weren't we were nothing to them. They saw us as ants, they saw us as irrelevance. And that's why they didn't say anything to us, because we were genuinely irrelevant to them. That's what Sforno says. The emphasis is not necessarily that they didn't see us. On the contrary, they did. They just consider us so completely irrelevant that it wasn't worth talking about. And there is a beautiful idea. He doesn't directly refer to the Sforno, but he develops a very profound thought from Rav Norman Lamb. There's a collection of his droshes. For many years, head of YU, yeah. And there's a huge collection of his droshes available. And a drosh of Parshas Shelach in 1952, he explained a medrash. The medrash says that there was that the following incident occurred. I'm not sure, it's probably brought somewhere as well here. I can't find it for now. But anyway, the medrash says, yes, it is. Yes, the Baal HaTurim brings it. You can see the medrash in the Baal HaTurim. The medrash in the Baal HaTurim. That what does it mean? The Yoshver Kechagov Sha'anak Echad, the Baal HaTurim says, Sha'anak Echad, there was one giant, Ochal Rimon, ate a pomegranate, V'zorak HaKlipa, and he threw away the shell. V'chol Yud Beis Meraglim Nichnasu Leishei B'Tzocha Mivnei Atzel, and all 12 spies went and sat in the rind of the shell of the pomegranate, the kernel, right, for shade. And that's what the Baal HaTurim says. That's what it means, that its inhabitants were like locusts. They sat in it like locusts. They were literally like locusts. They literally behaved like locusts and went inside the shell of the pomegranate. Very difficult medrash to understand. What's the idea of the pomegranate and the giant throwing away the pomegranate? And he says that the message of Chazal is that the Meraglim had no self-respect. He refers to them as Golos Jews. He says there are some Jews, unfortunately, they will accept even a hollow shell as long as it was once used by a non-Jew. They have no self-respect. Like, they use the hollowed out shell of the pomegranate that was cast away by the inhabitant of the land, and that was more important to them. They accept it even if it's emptied of nothing and all there is a husk that's left. He says, these are people who have tremendous stature amongst the Bnei Yisrael. They're Roshei Bnei Yisrael, they're heads of the Shvatim, etc., right? And he says, what a self-debasement, what a disgrace that they arrive in this new place, and all they can do is they can hide inside the shell of a pomegranate that's thrown out by a giant. The message he's trying to say behind the Medrash is that if a person has no self-respect, if we think of ourselves as completely like an insignificant insect, then that's what happens, and everyone else will think of us the same way as well. And what he goes on to develop in this drasha was this idea of how we have consistently suffered from this problem of not being proud enough and having a self-respect enough as Jews, so that we go into a foreign place. I mean, this wasn't it's Israel in Canaan, but it's the same. It's a mindset, right? And we think like, as long as I can get some sort of recognition, from those who are not Jewish, then I'm happy. Why can't we be sure of our own values and ideals in the context of 1952? It's just interesting as a historical idea. The example he brings was the mayor of Haifa visited New York, and he was given tremendous respect by the local Jewish dignitaries. I think it sounds like, right? And he sort of Schrei's Gewalt about it. He says, this was someone who had kept the buses going on Shabbos, Nebuch, right in Israel, because famous that's what happened in Haifa. And he says, how can it be that we can show you can show covered? We have to be respect. We have to have the the ability and willingness to stand up for what we believe in, and what self-esteem, exactly, to be able to stand up and say, yes, we're proud of where we are and having to be able to live and having a state of our own, but we need to make sure that it has that has an neshama. If we take out of it, this is what he goes on to say. If we take that out of it, what are we left with? We're left with just trying to be a nationalism like anyone else. That's not the aim. The aim is to have a land of kedusha. The aim is to be in our land and live proudly in our land as Jews. It's just a very interesting piece. You give some other examples as well, but that's the one that was most current to that time. The next idea is yes. So there's an Toras Chaim. There's an Toras Chaim, Perek Yud Daled Posuk Lamed Vov. Just to move on a bit further. So yes, so the pasuk says, now the problem with this pasuk is that the entire pasuk seems to be superfluous, seems to be unnecessary. In other words, it seems to be a repeat repetition. The decree is given Yom Lashana, right? Day for a year, and that will be 40 years. And Hashem says, this is what I will do to this Eidah Hara Hazos, this evil congregation, because of what they have done. Then it says, and the men that Moshe sent to spy out Eretz Yisrael, and they returned, and they made everyone else complain, to speak Lashon Hara about the land. And then they divided. But that whole pasuk, we know they did that. We know he sent them. We know they went to see Eretz Yisrael. We know they came back. We know they spoke Lashon Hara. So what is the purpose of this pasuk? Fair question, right? That's what the Toras Chaim asks. He says, the whole pasuk seems to be superfluous, and we know all these details. And he says that, and it's a beautiful idea. He says, to understand this pasuk, you need to basically ask another question first, which is, why is it that they were punished so severely? Surely there is the concept of erech hapayim. We say that it's in the Parshas Shelach. Hashem delays his anger, his wrath. Why did that not happen here? Why was it that they were punished in this way, so categorically? And he says the answer is because there are five things which can, chas v'shalom, cause the wrath of Hashem to flare and not to be able to have that erech apayim, the length of anger. And he says number one is the delayed anger. Number one is number one factor you can have is a person who is themselves a great individual, an important person, right? Who rebels against Hashem, right? That's not the same as an ordinary person doing it. Number two, a person who is in a good chevra, but he doesn't follow that. He goes away from a good chevra, right? That also creates a situation which can lead to charonaf. Number three, when a person has a sensitivity that wakes him up and realizes, don't do this, don't do the wrong thing, right? And he doesn't listen to it. Number four, if a person sins and causes others to sin, causes the public to sin. And number five, if the sin itself is distant from an ordinary sin, it's something meshuna, something really strange and outrageous. And he says, if you look at this pasuk carefully, you'll see that every phrase in this pasuk is referring to one of these five elements. In other words, it's a justification. It's an explanation as to why they were punished so severely. That's why this pasuk is here, right? What are the five elements? Says the Toras Chaim. Number one, because it starts by saying anoshim, the men, and we know anoshim is chashivas, is important. So the first factor was there. You understand? They were significant people, and therefore the anger came from Hashem because they should have known better. And they had a responsibility to act in a different way, right? You understand? Yeah, it's very significant. Number two is that it says Asher Shalacho Som Moshe, that Moshe sent them. they were his agents, they were his shlichim, and therefore, how could it be? They were part of a chevra. It's the second factor. They were part of a chevra. They had a responsibility. They were chevras Moshe Rabbeinu, part of Moshe Rabbeinu's chevra. So how much more? Of course, they should have known better. Number 3, vayoshuvu. What does that mean? That means that when miracle was done for them, that they survived, and they did this very dangerous journey, and they came back, right? And the giants didn't touch them, and that should have woken them up. They should have understood that Hashem was protecting them, which is the third factor that the Toras Chaim mentioned, right? The third factor is when a person has a hisorurus, something which is going to prevent him sinning, he doesn't take notice of it, right? The fourth is, it says in the next, the pasuk carries on, vayolinu, Allah is called ha'edah. That means to say, they caused others to sin. And that was another reason why they had to be punished, because they were chotem achdis arabim. And finally, the fifth factor is the hotzi dibur ala oretz. Right? They spoke negatively about Eretz Yisrael. Who would have such a chutzpah to speak negatively, he says, right? On Eretz Yisrael. He says, who would say it's negative? How can anyone do such a thing when it is entirely the opposite of that? And therefore their sin was strange. It was a weird thing to do, to speak negatively about the land they'd heard so many positive things about. So the Toras Chaim says this pasuk is coming to tell you the 5 factors, right? All 5 factors as to why they were punished so severely. Because it's midah keneged midah, and it's a situation where that each one of them in itself represents a reason that compounded their sin, if you like. Okay. And the final idea I want to share with you, which is a links back to this idea of the perspective they had, and how wrong the perspective was, which led to such negative consequences, is a beautiful piece by Rabbi Birnbaum in trying Shlita and trying to understand the Mapilim. So Mapilim is a bit difficult to understand, right? The Mapilim are those who try and go for it. They make a break, we're going to go, right? They do, but they don't get there. The Mapilim are people right at the end of the whole story, you can blink and miss it, right? Perik Yudala Posuk Mem Dalet, right? They want to go up. They get up in the next morning after the Meraglim. It's all a disaster. They get up Tisha B'Av morning, as it would be, right? And they we're going up. Right, we're going to go up. We're going to get there. We're going to go. Yeah. And Moshe says to them, it's not going to work. He loads it stuff. If you transgress the word of Hashem, Hashem has told you you're not going now. Hashem has told you 40 years. You break that, lo tzitzlach, it will not succeed. Al Ta'alu, he says, Hashem is not with you, and yet they push and they go. Vayapilu la'alos el rosh hahar. The Aaron Moshe doesn't go, and what happens? The Amaleki and the Kanani come down, and they destroy them. And basically, it doesn't work. It doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. And the basic question is, it says from Nevensal, what was so wrong? What was so wrong? They realized you could say they were the greatest Baalei Tshuva. They realized how wrong they were, and they were just desperate to put it right. Right? Well, they realized that the worst thing, they were people who surely had absorbed very, very quickly the fact that the Meraglim had completely gone in the wrong direction and had said, spoken negatively about Eretz Yisrael. The people were all afraid, everyone's scared, we're never going to win, and they're doing the exact opposite. It's real tshuva. We're going to go now. We're not even going to wait. So why was it such a bad thing? And he says that you have to understand that what this revealed, this incident, is that they didn't do tshuva at all. They hadn't done tshuva. They hadn't understood what they'd done wrong properly. Because having a good wish to do the right thing is not tshuva. Because if you get it in the wrong direction, and if you do the charota and the vidui and everything else, right, and the regret and everything, in the wrong direction, that's not tshuva, right? Yeah. What was it? And why was it the wrong direction? Because that the day before, he says, the people were convinced by the Meraglim that they would not be able to conquer Eretz Yisrael. Now, this is very strange, because they knew that Hashem had promised them they would conquer Eretz Yisrael. So it's very strange, right? You've got a group of people who tell you you're not going to win. Hashem himself has told you you're going to the Eretz of Aschalav Davash. So what's your dilemma? Why do you stop and question that? Why would you believe these people, right? The point is the nekudas hachet, which again, that's what they've got to put right. The point of the sin is what? That they thought that the giants and all of the conquering of the land, it was based on them and their own efforts and their own activities and what they'd be able to do and whether they would be strong enough or not. It was a Gorem Atzma'i, he says. It was like an individual, based on the normal causation in the world, what we can call, what they could do themselves, right? Now, as if, chas v'shalom, nothing to do with the control of Hashem. And when Moshe told them not to enter Eretz Yisrael, they understood they made a mistake, but they didn't understand what really the mistake was. They thought the mistake was they didn't value Eretz Yisrael enough. Had we respected it enough, had we wanted it enough, we would go despite the danger. But that's wrong. That wasn't the mistake. The mistake was that they didn't value enough the Dvar Hashem, the word of Hashem, that Hashem had told them they would be successful. You understand? There's a big difference. There were two possibilities of understanding what their mistake was. They could have understood, right? One is, our mistake was we don't value Eretz Yisrael enough. So we don't have enough Mesiras Nefesh. We're not going to commit ourselves to conquer it and everything else, right? But the deeper level, that wasn't really their mistake. Really, their mistake was they didn't trust Hashem. That Hashem, the word of Hashem rules everything. And if Hashem tells you you're going to be successful, you're going to be successful. And if Hashem tells you not to do something, don't do it. Hashem tells you, wait 40 years, you listen to Hashem. That's more important than what you think is right. And that's the mistake they make. And therefore, what happens the next morning is a direct continuation of their mistaken view. Hashem says, don't go. And they go, right? And therefore, they didn't forsake the sin, azivas hachet, which is necessary for tshuva. They didn't do that because yesterday they thought that the meraglim is some outside force which has more control over events. And today they think, right? They think that the Eretz Yisrael itself is a separate value outside the word of Hashem. That's what they think. They think, Hashem has told us not to go. Yeah, but it's Eretz Yisrael. So we've got to run and we've got to go, even though Hashem has told us not to. Of course, that's an error. And obviously that's wrong because he says like this, that anything that stands against the word of Hashem, it can be Eretz Yisrael itself. It doesn't have a value when it goes against what Hashem says. He says, Odom hamamit, shamazuzah muderes v'hayofesh shebepischoi, hi hamagena olov. A person can be the biggest believer if he thinks that the mezuzah itself is what's protecting him from harm. He's very close to being an Avodah Zarah. It's not the mezuzah. It's the word of Hashem. It's keeping what Hashem tells you to do that protects you. Everything is the Dvar Hashem, right? Hashem commands us to put a mezuzah on our doorway. That protects us. Keeping the mitzvah. It's all about the Dvar Hashem. That is what protects us. And he says that's how it's the Shaul HaMelech. When Shaul HaMelech says, he makes the excuse, I didn't destroy Amalek, right? Yeah, the sheep. What does it say in the Novi? Ki chatas kesem meri. Now, this is an unusual phrase, right? He basically says that Mary is rebelling against Hashem. If you say that you want to offer something to Hashem, that's what he said. I'm gonna offer these korbanos, these sheep of the Amalekim, right? But if that's against the word of Hashem, that means you're giving a value, an erech to korbanos, which is separate to the will of Hashem. Hashem tells you not to do it, and you say, I think I should. And that is like a kesem. What is a kesem? A kosem is like a witchcraft or whatever, or sort of incantation or whatever, that type of thing, right? What does the kosem say? The magician says that by eating a certain herb or something like that, that's going to help me, right? Right? And the answer is, he's saying that of his own back, right? This is what I think is the right thing to do. And that's not right. It's not correct. You've got to work up what the word of Hashem is. Doesn't matter what you think is right. And therefore, that is the continuation. And that's a beautiful link, I think, to the idea that we said before, right? The idea of the fact that they look at themselves as nothing, and the idea of the of the kliyokar, and they go through the derech hateva, and they say we can't control, we can't conquer it, it's not possible, They ignore the fact that Hashem has told you will, and the people who want to go out afterwards, they make the same mistake. The next morning they say it's true Hashem has told us not to go, but we have a cheshbon, we have a good cheshbon. Our cheshbon is that we want Eretz Yisrael so much we're just going to go and conquer it. Sounds good in theory, but it's not, because you missed the point. The whole point was you were supposed to realize that the Dvar Hashem rules everything, right? And that's what Rabbi Birnbaum says, which I think is a beautiful pshat. My apologies. The next happens to be the next couple of weeks is going to be a bit difficult because we've got a wedding next Thursday night and the week after, and it's Shalom for Shabbos. So we will advertise when we can hopefully resume. Okay. Thank you for joining. Have a good Shabbos.
Thank you very much. Good Shabbos.
Okay, good Shabbos.